Chapter 21 River Ridge. Haille's body was lead when he woke. A weight many times greater than his own kept him down in the mud, the weight of a millstone, the weight of a mountain, it might have been, for how weak he was. For a long time all he could do was breathe. The effort of movement, the rising and falling of his chest felt as if it would exhaust him. He stared upwards and realized that the bowl of the sky was splintered into countless fragments, the cracks yawning open wide and black. It was a few minutes, or maybe hours that passed before he realized that what he stared at was not a subterranean cavern, but rather an overcast sky, cut up by the bare branches of trees stripped of leaves by the wind and season. It dawned on him slowly then that he was not quite dead, that he was improbably alive. He was not sure if he had just woken up to die, but he was starting to recognize the fatigue that came like clockwork after a seizure. But the cold wrapped his body completely, cold that even covered his head, encasing it like a helm, a hood. He heard the swirl and drip of water. He turned his head only to have coldness splash his face and water invade his lungs. His body showed renewed vigor as he coughed, and suddenly he was lucid again and struggling to rise out of the creek bed where he had been left to drown. The air on his soaking body was little better than water. He shivered, his teeth clacking. More water swirled, the creek turning muddy with his movements toward shore. Crouched on the bank, he regarded the stream with a dread too great for him to feel relieved. All they had needed to do was to have tossed him a little farther, or face down. Inches would have done it. But as it were, they had been too rushed or too scared of his own condition to touch him in the way it would have taken to finish him. He had to crawl out of the mud. He knew that much. He was far too weak to care how it covered his body, stuck to his hands, forearms, torso as he crawled through it. The bank itself was insurmountable, but he surprised himself, finding a reserve of strength to take hold of exposed tree roots and draw himself under the cottonwood branches to sleep. Just to sleep. When he awoke the second time, it was pain that replaced fatigue. Pain from the blows that he had sustained. And pain in his gut. Hunger. It was night, the bullfrogs loud in their nocturnal chorus. This time was different. This time he immediately moved to get up, even though the pain struck back at him as relentless and complete as the blows themselves. He had to stop halfway to his knees, surprised by the places pain found on his body, his back, his neck, the crest of his hip, his thumb, and the third and fourth fingers of his right hand, even his face. But to stop moving was to invite stiffness and more aching, more cold, so he staggered up. He had walked several steps before he realized he was headed for what was left of the camp of tents. He was practically among them before he worried of being spotted by other escapees or by Redmont's men, but he found he did not care, or at least did not care enough in the face of cold and hunger. Many of the tents had been torn down. The far side of the camp had been burned, and the only things left were smoking ashes and empty stakes. The closest tents to him, those farthest from the center of the camp, had survived. Haille decided he would go no further than those. He ducked inside and rifled through what belongings were left. He pulled off his sodden clothes, more pain as he stretched and strained, and put on a pair of breeches and a wool shirt. The former too long and the latter too short, but they were dry and warm. His boots had been stolen and there were no extras he could find. He would have to flee barefoot, and fleeing was the only plan. He knew he had to get away from the Greystone estate, from the sight of such unraveling, from such a defeat, from such agony, and if nothing else, he had to keep moving to stay warm. As he lifted the flap of the tent, raindrops began to dance on the canvas and strike up a patter on the fallen leaves of the forest floor. A tumble of thunder rolled overhead. Haille ripped free the canvas of the next tent he passed, wrapped it like a cloak about his body, and started east. The rain should have been a misery, but he welcomed it. Since a child he had loved storms, felt them somehow comforting. Yona had told him he used to cry at the thunder, not out of fear, but to be closer to it, closer to the rain. For some reason he associated it with his mother, although he had no memory of her, at least not one that he could recall. All he knew of her were stories and her grave, a monument in a cemetery surrounded by woods. In that moment, fleeing eastward, in bare feet, in stolen clothes, and reflecting upon his own broken family, he felt a potent longing for his friends, Caitlin, Val, and Cody. He would have even been glad to see that elk. This loneliness was worse than any physical pain he could ever feel. He heard his own voice, sobbing out to an indifferent, empty forest, and knew then that loneliness was not emptiness, but rather the full weight of the complete, uncaring world crushing down on his shoulders, a butterfly beneath a wagon wheel. That, in the end, would kill him, he imagined. But in the meantime, he decided to keep moving eastward, mostly out of habit, mostly to keep warm. Hours passed. The rain continued, a comfort and companion. He welcomed it, for it cleansed him of the mud caked on his body, softened the path under his feet, and emptied the world, so to speak. For in the rain there was not a rider or hunter searching for him, no travelers to take note of him and betray him to bounty hunters or other escapees bent on revenge. Not even wolves to track him, as they would surely remain in their dens. So he moved freely and invisibly across an abandoned landscape curtained by rain. Out here in the Eastlands, nothing seemed complete. It was a region of unclaimed lands where poor families set up farms on irregular plots. Some thrived, some did not. Those that failed were marked by sod buildings slowly melting back into the soil from which they came. The roads leading to their property overgrown with stationary traffic of knee-high weeds and other autumnal growth. But for every plot returning to the wild there was the occasional branch road that was still well-trod, the ruts deeply worn so that on any other day, without rain, they would have been busy with carts, animals, and men coming and going. In the center of each homestead, Haille knew, would be a family thriving with the help and contact of other families. He wondered if the proximity of the wild made them closer. Was the irony that these farm communities enjoyed more solidarity than the closely packed residents of the city where anonymity ruled? He felt feverish, the emptiness of his stomach, a weakness radiating out of him into his limbs, a dizziness that grew worse with each movement of his head. Still he pressed onward, through the downpour, even as blood swirled in the footprints he left behind in the mud. The rain slackened in the afternoon. When he heard a rider coming from the west, he retreated into the trees on the side of the road. The rider, a young man, perhaps a courier, passed without spotting him. When Haille tried to rise again, his head spun and he had to lean against a tree and wait for some semblance of equilibrium to return. His skin was crawling with fever now, but he had a destination in mind. He just had to reach Rivertown, although he had no idea how near or far it was. But there he could find refuge. He could start over. He slept the night in the woods, drinking from streams. He dreamt of broken fences, roads of marching trees, and families with carts trying to find their way from a city encrusted in filth to the wild where green things grew freely. In the morning when he woke, his hunger had turned from a pain in his torso to a general malaise that was indistinguishable from the fever raging in his body. This day was white blindness, with a fog settled on the fields and in the forest so that he could see no farther than a few feet ahead. He found that he was too weak to stand and wondered if he could expire here in these trees. It would not be such a terrible place to pass, he thought, amid drifts of leaves the color of fire and sun, and cool, moss-softened stones and tree trunks. A voice reached through the thickness of the fog, accompanied by the clump of a hoof, the jingle of a bridle, and the groan of a wagon axle. The voice was that of a child, and Haille heard the deeper voice of an adult respond, even though he could not understand what was said. He stood, if what he was doing, doubled over, his chin on his chest, could be called standing. Wet leaves shuffled at his feet. He moved from one tree to the next, leaning heavily with hands covered in grime and nails dark with dirt. But he pushed forward. He could hear the cart as if it were right next to him, even if the road was maddeningly far away. He cursed his own efforts to hide from the road the day before as he stumbled over stones and roots. The ditch beside the road came into focus. He made no effort to step over its filthy trough and instead splashed through the stagnant water and threw himself down on the road, the edges of his vision turning black, the sound of the wagon so close. But he was unsure if it had already passed or was still approaching. He could not manage to stay conscious long enough to find out. This time he woke in a bed. It was warm, not the racking, trembling warmth of fever, but the soft, safe enclosure of blankets, bedding, and the accompanying sound of a fire. Haille tried to focus his eyes. He did not recognize the room, nor could he remember how he got there. He waited a few beats, relieved to be in the relative safety and comfort of a bed, indoors at that, and waited for his memory of the place and recognition to return. It didn't. The room did not resolve into one he knew. Nothing was familiar. The walls were made of irregular stones mortared together, the floor made of wood planks, the nail heads worn down to look like shiny coins. Through a square window he could see white clouds scudding across a cerulean sky. Next to the bed was a table that held a mug. Haille reached out a trembling hand to touch it. It still held traces of warmth. He took the handle, spilled some of the tea on the pillowcase, then drank it down, emptying the cup, his thirst taking precedent over any caution regarding what he was drinking. He set the empty mug down and shifted beneath the covers. Familiar aches and pains returned, but the severity had lessened. He leaned back and slept and woke, stringing together rests like gaps on a necklace of consciousness. The window rattled. It was windy outside. He was contemplating wrapping himself in a blanket and moving next to the fire when he heard footsteps, and the door creaked open. She wore an indigo dress, and her waist was wrapped by a wide belt, the silver buckle similar to the amulet on her neck, except the buckle was inlaid with polished bone, carved into some intricate shape of ancient meaning. In her hands was a large kettle that, from the way she hefted it with both hands, Haille could tell was full. "Good," she said in a firm voice. "The near dead awakens." She passed by Haille, her coal-lined eyes studying him, and hung the kettle over the fire. She took a pot off the hob and dished out a thick stew that smelled of rosemary, chicken, and peppers into a wooden bowl that she handed to Haille. From some unseen place at the end of the bed, she produced half a loaf of brown bread. Haille found himself suffering from an embarrassment of riches, unsure what to eat first. Finally he tore at the bread, dipped it into the chicken stew, and crunched down on it, savoring the explosion of tastes and textures in his mouth, not to mention the pleasure of finally filling his stomach. The woman picked a few sticks from a wood carrier on the hearth, broke them and tossed them on the fire. By the time the flames had risen and she turned back to Haille, he had finished his first helping. "Starved," she said, taking the bowl and refilling it. He nodded his head with as much vigor as he could gather. "Thank you." He was not healed, but he was better by leaps and bounds by the time he finished his third helping. The woman sat on the end of the hearth, sipping her own cup of tea, looking from the fire to the window, then to Haille as he ate. She got up and took the empty bowl from him. He politely refused a fourth helping. "Your kindness is appreciated with gratitude I cannot express." Haille began to speak but broke off sobbing. He was not sure why, but his eyes turned to streams. He could find no words, but his reaction almost seemed expected on the part of the woman, who got up, sat down on the bed next to him, and placed her hands on the blanket covering his knees. There, she said. "You have been through a great deal. Here, let me tend to your stitches." "Stitches?" "Yes, you truly were worse for wear when you arrived. Let me see your head there. Had to cut away some of your hair." Haille realized his head was wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it gently. He could smell a pungent salve on it, and rose and wood smoke on her. He appreciated the attention but steeled himself against any oncoming pain. It was unnecessary. Her touch was soft, and after applying a different salve that looked and smelled a lot like honey, she replaced the bandages and patted his knees again. "Where am I?" "Why, I thought you knew. After all, you were the one who asked to be brought here." "I did?" "Well, if you consider one word a request, it was all you could say in your state." "What word was that?" "A name. Yonasale." "Yonasale." "Yona," Haille said, breathing in deep, the smell of wood smoke and honey filling his nose. "Lady Yonasale," the old woman said. "Do you know her?" "You are lucky I do, and that the family of traders that found you did as well, and where to find her manor." "River Ridge? I'm at River Ridge?" "You are. Now, might I ask you how that name came to be on your lips?" "Yona, well, she is the closest person. She is like an adopted mother to me." "Then I think I know who that makes you." I'm Haille Hillborn." His own name came slowly to him after so long playing a different role. But something told him it was safe to reveal his true identity to this woman. Something about her spoke of protection, authority, even power. She also seemed familiar. Perhaps it was her Rivertown accent, so much like Yauna's. "If I am at Riveridge, then you must be Lorna," he said, sitting up. "None other." Haille could not believe his luck. It was better than waking up in his own bed. He had made it to Rivertown alive and was at the estate of Yauna's, with her mentor, whom he had never met but felt like he already knew. A knock sounded at the door and a young girl opened it. She had mahogany hair woven into thick braids and a long skirt with flowers sewn into its hem. She removed Haille's dirty dish without word and placed folded garments on the seat of a chair next to the window. Lorna thanked her. She nodded back, offered a nod to Haille, then left as quietly as she came. "You will need these," Lorna said, patting the pile of clothes. "But don't feel too hurried to leave bed. You'll still be weak. When was the last time you ate?" "I don't know," Haille said after some thought. "The last days are a blur." "Well," Lorna said, refreshing Haille's cup of tea, "why don't you start from what you do recall?" As long as he could remember, Haille had known Yauna, and as long as he had known Yauna, he had heard stories of her mentor, Lorna. She was a legend to him, yet a familiar one, not unlike an aunt or grandmother. His story tumbled out, starting back with Yauna and how upset she had been at him. Caitlin, his father, the font, Annabeth, Annabelle, Garn, Vondales, Red, Rim, Goust, Val, and Cody, even the elk. Lorna listened without speaking, without changing expression, but never did he doubt that he held her full, concentrated attention. When he had finally finished, she sipped her tea. "A long journey, and not just by distance," she said. He was not sure exactly what she meant, but he was relieved to share it, relieved to have survived it, and relieved not to face judgment or condemnation for his many mistakes. If anything, Lorna showed sympathy in her tone as she got up, touched his knees once more, and said, "I will leave you to rest, but we will talk. Oh, how we will talk."